Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 351. And I'm back from Japan, so this is a special episode dedicated to my largely excellent shopping experiences looking for jazz records in Japan, principally but not exclusively Tokyo. And before I get into that, I'd just like to give a shout out to several people who pointed me really very squarely in the right direction, did me a real solid in terms of recommendations. As some of you know, I reached out in video asking for recs a, a couple of weeks ago or so, and a few people, just to mention them by name. Florencio Paiva is one. Another is somebody who goes by the YouTube handle of Archaeologists. And I would be remiss if I didn't also mention this channel's own pro bono AV consultant and all around Impulse Records guru, Maurizio Ortolani. So thanks to all three of you for some really excellent suggestions that helped me a great deal. In this video, I'll start off with a wee description of where we went in Japan. I will then talk about my largely excellent, as I mentioned, record shopping experiences, and then I'll do a quick run through of the records which I found. As you'll see, I went crazy, not really crazy, but just a little bit crazy because the selection is just incredible. So I was in Japan for 2 weeks with my son, who's quite happy, he tells me, to remain anonymous in this video. And he is now still in Japan, having shaken the old man off his shoes, and he's off having fun on his own, so more power to him. Altogether, we stayed in 4 different places and we day tripped to a few more. First of all, we went to Nagano, which is a little bit like the Japanese equivalent of Banff or Aspen. It's in the so-called Japanese Alps and has a population of about 350,000 people. Most people will recall that the Winter Olympics were held there at one point. We were lucky to be there during their summer festival and got up to some hijinks there. We also got up into the mountains. We managed to visit 2 nearby places of historical interest, Kisu Fukushima and Matsumoto, which has a really spectacular samurai-era castle. Then it was on to Kanazawa, which is a port city on the Sea of Japan, and there was some really good record shopping here and some great jazz listening bars, and I'll get back to that shortly. Kanazawa has a magnificent castle as well as historical samurai and geisha districts. And from there, we visited Shirakawa-go, which is a traditional village, which, as you can see, this style of building houses with these tremendous thatched roofs. We spent time in Takayama, which has a big historical area in the center of town. And then a week in Tokyo, the biggest city of them all. How big? Tremendously big. And it's hard to grasp exactly how big Tokyo is, but if you think of a city which has the footprint of Mexico City, but the height of New York, you come pretty close. We spent a week there in some of the busiest areas, frankly, on the whole planet, but also in some really tranquil spots. We were spoiled for choice every night by this incredible population of izakayas, which is, well, they're kind of Japan's answer to the French bistro or to the English pub, but somehow transcending and almost better than either of those. I know, sacrilege. It's a city of amazing sights, incredible food, spectacularly efficient public transport, incredible cleanliness, and above all, great jazz records. So why is Japan such a hotbed of jazz and of used jazz vinyl by implication? I'm no expert. One of my regrets about this trip is that I didn't brush up on enough Japanese and I hadn't read up enough on great Japanese jazz artists to maybe make as much of the trip as I could. But nevertheless, there was still lots to explore and lots to encounter. And as far as I could tell, as vibrant as the domestic jazz scene is, Japanese music fans also have an incredible appreciation of American jazz. And this dates from that decade, a very difficult decade for Japan, actually, after the war, from 1945 to 1955. And this is a really interesting period because when you go there and you go to museums or art galleries or what have you, that particular 10 years is kind of a silent 10 years. You have to understand it must have been enormously traumatic, not just the use of nuclear weapons, obviously, but many other cities were reduced to ashes. The whole, the presumptions of the old regime had been smashed and scattered, and that regime, to a large extent, discredited. And the whole society is traumatized. And there's a group of young people who are now coming into the world. The ideas of their parents have, as I said, been somewhat discredited. There are a lot of American troops there. They brought with them American music. They brought with them American musicians. There were a lot of jazz musicians, of course, who spent time in the services and were gigging at night in Tokyo and other places. And jazz music starts to become and to represent this idea of a better, more modern, more promising future than whatever the traditional Japanese approach had been, certainly as manifested in what had happened in the latter stages of the war. So the younger generation really starts to embrace jazz, and within a few years, not just an appreciation of jazz and a consumption of jazz music, but also a whole new generation of young Japanese jazz musicians starts to arrive, and they really begin to flourish through the 1960s. As in a lot of places, the 1960s were a period of real ferment. The Japanese government prior to the war had tried to insulate Japan from Western influences because as Japan rose to challenge the West in terms of its imperial ambitions and so on, the erosion of traditional Japanese culture was something that the regime was worried about. But now that resistance to external culture was over, and there was a fundamental embrace in many ways by Japanese of Western and certainly of American culture, and that includes jazz. The performance of the music was booming, but so also was the consumption of the music, and Japanese were buying American pressings of American jazz records in such numbers that it began to become economically viable for companies like King and Victor to license Blue Note and Prestige and Impulse and Riverside and other jazz productions, and to sell those in Japan, again in large numbers. And these are bought by Japanese collectors who are absolutely fastidious, as you'll know if you've ever bought secondhand Japanese vinyl, in their handling of their collections. I mean, after all, this is a country which has warm water bidets in every train bathroom on their cross-country network. So that gives you a bit of a sense of how well cared for and how much detail is placed on all aspects of the production and the maintenance and the storage and all the rest of it having to do with records in Japan. Long story short, Japan has an enormous inventory of extremely well cared for, well produced and manufactured jazz from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And so for someone like me, it's the promised land. In fact, on the basis of my, well, I won't say my global exploits, on the basis of my travels as a jazz record shopper so far, and that includes serious stints of looking for jazz records in London, in New York, in Los Angeles, in Mexico City, obviously Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal. I feel pretty comfortable stating that Tokyo, unless Kyoto or Osaka has some surprises to spring, is likely the greatest place in the world to go jazz record shopping. So most of my shopping occurred in Tokyo, unsurprisingly, but I would like to offer just a little shout out to Kanazawa, where I had three great jazz experiences. The first was at the record store in Record Jungle, which was fairly easy to find. Not always a given, actually, because one of my experiences of trying to find Japanese record stores is they're almost never on the ground floor. They're usually up a flight of stairs, or two or three or four flights of stairs, or an elevator, and the sign is sometimes very subtly placed higher up in the building. So you really have to trust that you're in the right place and just look around until you see the clue of the place you're trying to find. Anyway, Record Jungle was not too hard to find. It's about 2 minutes away from the main big open air seafood market in Kanazawa, which is something else and a place to go in and of itself. If you look at the size of this oyster I'm eating, this is just a small sample of what was on offer there. Record Jungle is run by a guy called Masa Nakamura, and it has a tremendous selection. I would say what you can see here, there's a lot more to the store, but what you can see here, something like 40% of the store is given over to youth jazz. And like almost every jazz record store I went to in Japan, the actual quality per pound of what was available in the used jazz section was fantastic. In fact, if this was the only store that I went to in Japan, in this small and unremarkable and fairly provincial city by Japanese standards, if this was the only one that I went to, it would still be one of the best record stores that I've ever been to in my life. So if you find yourself in that neck of the woods, it's highly recommended, and I'll discuss what I found in a little bit. The other two revelations I had in Kanazawa were not actually record stores at all, but listening bars. Now, I know that listening bars have popped up as a thing, and they're quite chic in London and some of the bigger US cities, but Japan has made a specialty of this for a long time, and they're very serious about it. And they're everywhere. In fact, my son and I hadn't actually made a point of going out to look for listening bars. We just happened across them. The first listening bar we found in Kanazawa was York Jazz and Drinks, which was amazing. It's owned and run by a woman called Sadako Okui. This is her here. She's run this bar for 50 years. This is her record collection, or at least some of it anyway. Almost all of what's on view here, you can tell from all the Impulse orange spines and so on, for instance, are all early pressings of the greatest jazz ever. And she also really knows her whiskey. So, needless to say, we spent quite a bit of time here. Here I am looking sweaty while my son chats away in Japanese to the owner, something I didn't actually know we could do before we went on this trip. Now, the second jazz listening bar we went to in Kanazawa was this little tiny place called Jazz Bar Rabbit Moon. And here's a photo of the outside. No word of a lie, this is the smallest bar that I've ever been in. It has something of a hoarding problem, or perhaps the owner does, I'm not sure. But in any event, I think it's just he's a collector, and fair enough, who am I to point fingers? It probably has room for 4 paying customers as well as himself. As you can see, you're sharing the bar with stacks of CDs. He also has an absolutely kicking sound system in there. At this point, my son had had his fill of jazz and whiskey, which I can't really imagine, but in any event, he'd gone off to do other things. And so I stuck around and chatted with the owner. I was the only person in the place. The guy's name is Katsu Ueda. He has, as you might imagine, a phenomenal jazz collection. And the rest of the evening was spent with him going and digging for things, obscurities, rarities, but also really good pieces of Japanese jazz that he thought I hadn't heard, which in most cases was true, and which I would like. And this was the winner of the whole evening, Blue City by Isao Suzuki, and more on this later, but this was just a fantastic evening, and if you get a chance and you're in Kanazawa, do drop by. But eventually, of course, we arrived in Tokyo, the big city. Now, the advice I'd had before going to Tokyo was basically as follows. Don't be put off by going to chain stores. They are likely to have the best selections of used jazz vinyl. And by and large, that advice was bang on the money. If there's one thing you take from this video, that should be it. However, you still have to know where to look. And one of the things about Tokyo, as I guess with a lot of big cities, is that there's no real downtown as such. There are just a whole bunch of different neighborhoods and districts, some of which are hipper or artier or busier than others. And it's within some of those key districts that it's best to look for the outlets of some of these chain stores. Now, the biggest music chain of all in Japan, certainly in terms of number of outlets, is something called Disc Union. But again, you can't just go to any Disc Union store because they will have different specialties, and you'll often actually have several different Disc Union stores within a few blocks of each other, some of which specialize in rock, some in CDs, some in K-pop, and others in jazz. As you might imagine, I went to the jazz specialty ones, all of which were recommended by viewers, and they were pretty much uniformly excellent. The first one I went to was Disc Union Jazz Tokyo, which is close to Meiji University and Okonomizu, if I'm pronouncing that right, metro station. This was off the charts incredible. They had stacks of used jazz vinyl by label, by artist, by instrument, and the typical records for sale were 50s and 60s US jazz pressings and 60s and 70s Japanese jazz pressings. They have their own grading system, which is a bit different from the old Goldmine standard. So the grading system they use is like A, A minus, B plus, B, and so on. But even the Bs I found were in, if not pristine, at least what I would call very good plus condition on the Goldmine standard. Highly, highly listenable, highly, highly collectible. The only downside, if you care about this sort of thing, which I really don't, but if you do, is that there's so much humidity in Japan, as you might be able to tell by how sweaty I appear in all these photos, that you get a fair amount of mildew, at least a lot of the time on some of the older records, so you get this sort of brown spotting and so on. But again, that's not something that really puts me off. I care more about the black thing inside. Now, I was interested in seeing what a regular Disc Union was like as opposed to a specialty shop. So I then went to Disc Union Jinbocho, which was a pretty nearby location, and they had a used jazz vinyl selection too, which, just to put this in perspective, was probably better than the jazz used section in 95% of North American stores. But although I did find a couple records there, I knew that there were far, far better locations, having already been to one that was far better than this one. And so I kind of held back and decided to save my fire for the recommended places, which was a good idea. Having been to the University District, the following day I then headed off to probably Tokyo's two busiest commercial hubs, Shibuya and Shinjuku. Shibuya, of course, is the home of the famous Shibuya Crossing Scramble, which is hilarious to be in, kind of hilarious to watch. And in the midst of all this, a reminder I saw of just how clean and orderly a place Japan is. Here is a woman who was spending a good minute picking up individual microscopic pieces of litter from the street with a pair of tweezers. And incidentally, on the topic of litter, there are no garbage cans in Japan. The expectation is that you have no right to leave your own personal trash in public areas, even within a designated garbage can. You don't have the right to do that. It takes a while. It takes a couple of days of carrying wrappers and cans around looking for garbage cans before you adjust, but you eventually do adjust. Back to record shopping, in Shibuya, the first place I went to was Disc Union Shibuya Jazz Rare Groove, which was flat out spectacular. Looking at this photo here, everything you can see on either side of that divider on the left, down both those rows, is top-notch used jazz. Had I had unlimited resources, I could happily have picked up 100 records at this location. The service, too, is amazing, and I'll come back to that in a second. One of the things to know about shopping for records in Japan is that the American jazz is ordered in the store, as you would expect in the US or Britain, by artist alphabetically. So, now it's by first name. So Art Farmer, Art Pepper are early on, and Zoot Sims at the very end. But that little quirk aside, it's as you would expect. The Japanese jazz, however, even if it's very similar kinds of music, it is separated off in a different section, often just using Japanese characters, so it's hard to find initially anyway, unless you know what you're looking for. Sometimes it'll be written in English, J-jazz. But again, even though it's alphabetized in Japanese, and I don't quite know how that works. So I typically had to work with the store clerks to find what I was looking for. So anyway, which brings me back to the question of service. So I was looking for records put out on the Three Blind Mice label and or records by Isao Suzuki. And so I talked to the clerk at this particular disc union and I explained what I was looking for. And he spent some time tapping on the computer to make sure he knew what I meant. And then he said, okay. And then he went off and he started to flip through basically all of these records that you can see in this photograph. And I realized this was going to take him forever. And it wasn't even clear he was going to find anything. I wasn't certain he knew who the artist was and so on. So, through sign language, it's like, don't worry about it. I'll never mind. And I went to, thanks very much. And I went to go and look at other parts of the store. Anyway, half an hour later, I ventured over back to that side of the store and he was still at it. He'd gone up and down both sides of that divider, looking through something like 1,000 records, and he'd pulled out no fewer than 6 Isao Suzuki records. Incredible. So I did pretty well there. Then I went to the Shibuya branch of Tower Records, which is a pretty impressive building. As you can see, there was a live Mario Kart thing happening on the street in front of it because the Nintendo headquarters is near there too. This was okay. It has a whole floor dedicated to used vinyl, which got me excited. Unfortunately, if you've ever been to a store where you feel like the collectors have been there first and it's kind of picked over and it's basically full of B-list stuff, that was kind of my experience at Tower Records. I think I got 1 or 2 records there, but it was pretty slim pickings. I then headed north in the metro, a couple of stops to Shinjuku, which is the busiest train station, I think, in the world. Certainly feels like it when you're there, and it's pretty easy to get lost. But I got out and I found Disc Union Shibuya secondhand. This was on a par with Disc Union Jazz Tokyo and Disc Union Shibuya Jazz Rare Groove, which is to say that it was spectacular. In fact, each one of those 3 Disc Union branches comfortably better than any other jazz vinyl shopping location I'd ever been to. And unsurprisingly, I did well there. Finally, it was time to try a couple of recommended independent stores. The first of those was in Shinjuku, and this was Hal's. One of the harder record stores to find. It ended up being up 3 flights, or I guess up 3 elevator floors once I'd found the elevator and through this little door, but it was worth the wait. Here's a shot of the inside. That's not Hal, but she runs the show, and this was a very well curated, perhaps slightly pricier, but still excellent treasure trove of used jazz vinyl. I picked up another handful of records here, and then finally it was off to Echo Records, which I'd passed up the opportunity to go to just a few days before when I'd been in the neighborhood because I was hurrying to do something else, I forget what, only to find that it was closed on Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays. Now, I know that record stores are quirky when it comes to their opening hours, but this really takes the cake. So because I was leaving on Saturday, I didn't have a chance to go to Echo Records. So a little bit of disappointment to end the week, but a week which nevertheless, in terms of an opportunity to shop for jazz records, was the best in my whole life as a record collector. So now it's time to run through quickly the records that I got on this trip, which which I'm pretty excited about. And I've arranged them kind of in reverse order of how excited I am. Not perfectly, but well, you'll see. Anyway, so the first is a bit of a roll of the dice by Yoichi Suzuki. It's from about 1960 on Jupiter Records, a very short-lived and obscure Japanese label called Latin Cocktail. It includes, in Japanese, I don't know if you can see, but that little thing in the box there is actually a recipe for a Latin cocktail. Um, so, yum. And anyway, this is a bit of roll of the dice. I suspect it's a little bit bossa-ish, but I'm not entirely sure, so we'll just have to see. The next is a 1978 pressing of Kelly Great by Win Kelly. This is a tremendous record, actually. It has, this is a VJ pressing, and it's got obviously Win Kelly, but Philly Joe, Lee Morgan, Wayne Shorter, and Paul Chambers, one of my great heroes on bass. Just fantastic, this one. This one is kind of hard to find. It's a 1977 Prestige repress of Oleo. It's a Thad Jones and others record. Who else is here? Frank West, the great reed player, Teddy Charles, Mal Waldron, Doug Watkins. Elvin is on here. Anyway, this you don't see this too often. It's really, really quite good. A bit traditional sounding, as you might expect with Thad Jones, but a very great sounding pressing. I had a chance to give it a little spin earlier today. Excited about that. Also excited about, I've been on a Red Garland kick lately, as you may know from the channel. This is Groovy by Red Garland with Art Taylor on drums and Paul Chambers again on bass. This was, a 76 Prestige repress. Now, a Japanese one, a bit of a roll of the dice, although I did a bit of research on it before I picked it up. Something called Melody of Japan, also and more commonly released as Lyrics of Japan. It's basically a bossa record from the late 60s by S. Sawada and his Jazz All-Stars. So again, this is pretty darn good. I listened to it a bit on YouTube on the way home on the plane. I haven't had a chance to spin it yet, but kind of fun. This one, I'm a West Coast jazz nut, as I think many of you will know. This is Jack Sheldon, later of Tonight Show fame and others, and he had put out a number of records on Jazz West, the originals of which are absolutely impossible to find. This is called the Quartet and the Quintet, which is a 93 Japanese repress, and quite a well-reviewed one too. George Wallington, New York scene, along with Phil Woods. This was Donald Byrd's first gig when he came to New York, was playing with George Wallington. So Donald Byrd's on here. This is another record originally released on New Jazz in the 1950s, and this is a 1972 Prestige repress. A Blue Note, Sonny Clark Trio. Sonny Clark Trio, again with Paul Chambers. I was on it, apparently, I wasn't planning this, but I got a lot of records with Paul Chambers playing bass on this trip. And Philly Joe. This is, well, I mean, it's hard to go wrong with any Sonny Clark record, frankly, but this is a really, really nice one. This is in 77. Is it who did it? I think it's it's a Japanese press, but I don't quite have the detail on who pressed it in Japan. Brown and Roach Incorporated, completing my Max Roach and Clifford Brown collection. This is a 71 Emercy repress. Well, Mercury, I think, but originally it was an Emercy release, and they, of course, are effectively the same company in mono. And speaking of Paul Chambers, here he is again with his eponymous album. Well, not eponymous, but his album called Go. Again with Cannonball and Win Kelly, Philly Joe, Freddie Hubbard, Jimmy Cobb. Hard to argue with that. It's an interesting record. It's not Paul Chambers' best, but there are some great moments on it. It's a VJ, and as such, it was likely a bit more of a rushed production than you might have had if it were a Blue Note. Here's a record, a Japanese record. I mentioned that I was looking for Isao Suzuki records, and this is one of the ones that guy found that I somewhat felt obliged to buy because he'd spent so much time looking for them, although this one is not well reviewed. It's actually a very new release of a recording from 1975, and I have not had a chance to even open it, let alone listen to it. but the reviews are not that great in terms of sound quality. So, well, we'll see what I think about it. But anyway, that was that. So that's a question mark, that one. No question mark over this. Art Farmer, Sing Me Softly of the Blues. This is an Atlantic repress, a Japanese one from 1992. The Japanese were still making really good vinyl in the early 1990s. That wasn't the case in many other parts of the world. Art Farmer again, When Farmer Met Grice, which is I think a late 50s original Prestige, but this is a 77 Prestige repress done by Victor in Japan. Here's something I said I'm getting more and more excited as we go through the pile. An original pressing of, was it original pressing? Maybe it's not. Yes, it is. An original pressing of Sadao Watanabe. Sadao Watanabe is one of the great early heroes of the Japanese jazz scene. I mentioned that people came through in the 1960s. He's one of them. And he was a great convert to the bossa nova sound too, which is another one of my passions. So here is his record, Bossa Nova 67, with his sextet. It is a really terrific record. It also has this fabulously textured cover, which Victor was doing around this time in the late 60s. Just feel that all day. Anyway, I'm very excited about that. Another record which you'll recall me referring to when I was talking about Horace Silver's Tokyo Blues record the other day, which is Hideo Shiraki plays Horace Silver. Now, Hideo Shiraki was a guy whom Silver befriended when he came to tour Japan in whatever it was, winter of 60, 61. And Shiraki, and here's Silver actually posing in a photograph with Shiraki. And this record is Shiraki playing, as you might imagine from the title of the record, all Horace Silver numbers. So he's playing Senor Blues, Sister Sadie, Blowing the Blues Away, Filthy McNasty. They're all spelt in a somewhat idiosyncratic way on the back. One of these tremendous sort of old glossy flipback records too. Anyway, quite excited about that. This is, however, not a 1962 original. It's a faithful reproduction from 1994, but again, from that period when the Japanese were still making great jazz records. Joe Gordon. Introducing Joe Gordon. Joe Gordon will be known to some for playing with Shelly Manne in some tremendous recordings from the early 1960s. This is him as a leader, originally on Emerson, but this is put out on Mercury. I actually had to enter this one on Discogs because this particular version with this font didn't actually exist. My best guess is this is a late 1960s repress, and my other guess is it's going to sound pretty good, but it originally cost 1,750 yen, but we'll see what it sounds like. Modern Art by Art Pepper. This, again, is a record which came out on, what was did it come out on New Jazz, or what did it come out on originally? Oh, it's Jazz West, I think it came out on originally, and you just can't find the original, at least not for anything like resembling reasonable money. But a good Japanese press is the way to go. This is a 1976 Japanese reissue. Actually, it was reissued on Blue Note, strangely, because for whatever reason, Blue Note had the rights to this record at that point. Blue Note, again, speaking of Blue Note, this is a Liberty Press of Lee Morgan's record Delightfully, which is, so it's not Japanese, it's an American press, a Liberty Press from the mid to late 60s. This is the one where he has a bit of a big band on some of the tracks. It's a somewhat oddball part of his catalog, but still pretty good, I have to say. Benny Golson. We've had Art Farmer, now we have Benny Golson. Another originally a new jazz release is the Prestige reissue from 1972, Groovin' with Golson. Contemporary. A contemporary I didn't have. There aren't too many of those these days because I went on a bit of a completist kick a few years ago. This is Teddy's Ready with the Teddy Edwards Quartet and featuring another one of my heroes on bass, Leroy Vinegar. This is a 1981 contemporary reissue, an American reissue. But again, contemporary tended to use all their own original metalwork, so I suspect this is going to sound pretty good as well. Bill Evans and Shelly Manne. I've had this record in various versions in my hands in about 5 different record stores in recent months or years and have never bought it. I don't know why, but it was always some other record I wanted to buy more in that particular store. This was at a very good price. It's a good pressing. It's from 1973. It's the one he did with Shelly Manne and Monty Budwig. Any record with Bill Evans on, I love. Any record with Shelly Manne on, I love. So this combination is frankly unbeatable. Nice gatefold there too. Getting more excited now. This is an original pressing of Jay and Kai on Savoy Records. Jay Winding, oh no, sorry, J. Johnson and Kai Winding, and they're a two trombone act. And this also includes Mingus on bass and Kenny Clark on drums. I have another version of this, but this is a very significant upgrade. Sadao Watanabe's debut record, I believe. It's a reissue from 1973. As you can see, it's a Japanese reissue on King. Stan Kenton, when his big band was on the wane in LA, made, I guess, some tidy pocket money by using his name to introduce a whole bunch of people who had sort of come through his orbit. And one of those, of course, was Serge Chaloff. And here is a 1955 original pressing of Boston Blow Up with Serge Chaloff. And who else is on this? Boots Masuli on alto sax, Herb Pomeroy on trumpet, Ray Santisi on piano, Everett Evans on bass, and Jimmy Zitano on drums. So if these guys can either play, or else I could probably make sure that you never hear from Paulie no more. One of the two. Anyway, looking forward to that one. Here is another one that's kind of exciting. A first Japanese press of Mal Waldron's Mal 1 on Prestige Records, a classic quintet record, and one which I've been looking for quite some time. Here's a record I bought several times, continually upgrading my version. And this is one which is a bit of a gamble, but it promises to be good. So right now, my version of Sonny Rollins' Way Out West is a much lauded OJC pressing. This one is a 1974 Japanese press, which gets some very, very, very good reviews. So I'm really interested to hear what it sounds like. And it's stereo too. I have a mono copy, I think. Or is it the other way around? I can't remember. Anyway, excited to hear that one. Another original press from the 50s. This is the Herb Geller Sextet. Herb Geller was married to Lorraine Geller, who was the real mainstay of Red Mitchell's first great quartet. Unfortunately, she died very young, and not long after this record is made too, of an asthma attack. She was in a sextet with her husband Herb. There's Herb in the back. There's that kind of mildewy business that you can see often affects Japanese records. But this is a first press, really a big part of that whole West Coast scene, and really quite keen to listen to that. Now, A Day of the Sun, which is, I think, late 70s, 1979, first press of this record by Masahiko Togashi and Asao Suzuki. And this is kind of a, well, it's on the freer jazz side of the spectrum, I guess, or end of the spectrum, end of the continuum, whatever it is. I was super excited to find this. I'm very excited to play it. I'm going to have to sort of reserve some special time to listen to this one. Very, very stoked. But the big prize of all, and you'll recall back to that jazz rabbity bar that I went to in Kanazawa, where I was speaking with Ketsu, the owner, and he was digging and finding great, great jazz. And I mentioned that I was really into Three Blind Mice records, and he pulled out the CD of this one. But I found, thanks to that long-suffering clerk at Disc Union Records, I spent a half hour pulling out records, and this was one of them. Blue City by Asao Suzuki's Quartet +1. This, by some people's estimation, is his best record and one of the greatest Japanese jazz records of all time. It is worth considerably more than I paid for it, which is true largely of most of these records. Actually, I didn't mention that, but it's also quite economical to buy jazz records in Japan. And again, I'm going to be setting aside some special time to listen to this one. So there you have it. So when it comes to jazz record shopping, there are lots of great places to do it, but Japan arguably is the place to be. Thank you, Japan, for the wonderful experience, and thanks to all of you for watching, and we'll see you next time.